So I'll tell you a little bit about who we are, because I don't know how many of you are aware of our center. We've been around since 1982, so it's been a while. It was started at the request of then Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who saw a need. He formed it around the model of Brookings in Washington, where he was looking for a think tank that would do very high-level work, but would not be dependent in any way on government, not in terms of funding and not in terms of direction of what research to do. But he was looking for socioeconomic research that he could depend upon. He could bank on the results and act based upon what the findings were. He turned at the time to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, because the American JDC, as opposed to the Israeli Joint, does not take any government funding from Israeli government. And he turned, and because it's an institution that knows how to raise projects and hold them up until they can stand on their own 2 feet, and that's what they did. They basically started the center, raised it up, funded it for a very long time until it was able to basically fund itself and stand on its own 2 feet, and that's where we are now. We're in a situation where we're, children of the joint, one of the offspring who has left the home, comes home to visit for the holidays or something. But we are still, proud members of the family, but we're a completely independent body.
So what funds you? If the government doesn't fund you and you're supposed to be independent, where do you get your funds?
So we first of all, we have a what's called Karen Smutai endowment fund. The endowment fund was established by the JDC together with 5 families, and all U.S. families, and they put together enough to give us basically close to about 1/3 of our annual budget. The rest comes from individuals. We have a board that's a giving board, and other individuals who give us donations, and all kinds of different foundations that we get money from.
So it's a nonprofit, or
it's nonprofit. It's nonprofit. It's however you want to do it, that's fine. I actually really like an interactive discussion in general. In general, I prefer an interactive discussion. So even as we're going on and I'm showing you things, then I'm happy if you interrupt, ask questions, because that way you get the information that you want to get. And if you ask me a question I don't know the answer to, I'll just make something up. So. But I'll try to make sure that you don't know. You're not able to notice that they made it up. So it's really all private, and the things that we research are the things that we in-house think are the important things to research. We don't take any directed research. In other words, we can't have somebody turn to us. It happens. Somebody turns and says, "We'll give you money if you do the following project." We don't do that. We will listen to ideas. We keep a database of ideas that we get from all kinds of places and that we come up with by ourselves. And we have very, very large. We have really top people in each and every field that we research. We research health, education, welfare, labor markets, macroeconomic policy inside of Israel. The only things we don't touch at all. We don't touch politics. Nothing to do with politics. We stay very, very neutral, and we are seen therefore as honest brokers. And what that does is it means that all doors are open before us. All the parties come and talk to us. All the ministries come and discuss with us, independent of who the prime minister is or who's in power, who's not in power. It doesn't really matter. They all come and want to know what we're doing. And we try to give a very, very balanced picture of what we do. The other thing we don't do is we don't touch anything dealing with security, because but we basically deal with everything. I met with President Rivlin earlier in the year, and he said, you guys basically do everything that's important to Israeli citizens except for defense, except for security. And that's really what we do. Very, very high level work. We put out research throughout the entire year. We have 2 flagship publications. One is this little book that you have over here, which is our bestseller. By the way, we don't sell anything. Everything is free. And everything's on our website, and everything's in English and in Hebrew. But it's all available for free online. But everybody loves this book because it's, every page tells a story. Behind each of these pages stands a whole research piece that was done. And we put out also at the end of the year a book, which is a 400 or 500 page book, which will have full research pieces inside of it. We'll have, first of all, overviews of each of the fields that we look at. So it'll give you a picture of what's going on, what the important things are, what's changed, what needs to change. So those will appear in that book, plus a whole bunch of new chapters, new research pieces that we'll put out at that point. That's called The State of the Nation. We put that out in December every year. This one comes out somewhere around the middle of the year, usually May or so. We try to put it somewhere around Independence Day in Israel. We never exactly make it, but we're usually close. And I think that gives you the background of who we are. And when I spoke with Selwyn, what he asked that we speak about today is talking about high-tech inside of Israel, and that's what I geared the talk to. I will always gear my talk towards what the audience think is important, want to hear, want to know about. And that's most of what I'm going to frame this around, but there's going to be a lot of stuff coming up before that. Okay, so if there are any more questions about who we are. Okay, as Michal said, we have about 25 people. About 15 of them are researchers. We have a very good dissemination group. One of the things we make sure that we do, we make sure that every piece that we put out, every piece of research, that it gets to the people who need to see it. The decision makers in particular, and government agencies who need to see that. We make sure that it gets to them, very often with a letter explaining what the main findings are, inviting them to discuss it if they want to. And we are, because of that, we really have an effect. We have a very big effect on what's going on inside of Israel. So with no further ado, let me tell you a little bit about Israel. Now this is stuff you might know, some of it, you might know all of it, but we'll just run through a few details about Israel. So Israel is what we call, what I like to call a small island economy. So it's an island economy. An island economy, basically think about Australia. If something happens inside of Australia to disrupt, let's say, trade in a certain good or production of a certain good, well, to start bringing that good over from farther away is logistically more difficult than, let's say, you were landlocked in the middle of Europe. If you have a problem, some country in the middle of Europe, you can just bus it across, or you can send it by truck, send it by train. Consumers can cross the border and purchase the goods elsewhere. If it happens in Australia, then you have to get prepared for it. You have to change things. So if there's a disruption to competition coming from outside, the competition has to come from further abroad. And that means that the competition is not as immediate as you might get in some place, in other places, or in a state in the United States. Israel is an island economy. Not that it's surrounded by water, but it's surrounded by countries with which it doesn't really trade. And therefore, even the little trade that it does have with Egypt or with Jordan is very, very minimal, not substantial in any way. And therefore, the type of competition they get from outside is going to be somewhat limited. It's small. Being small is, there are 9 million people now in Israel. We just reached 9 million. And with 9 million people, the number of producers you're going to have in every field isn't going to be very large. So the amount of competition you tend to have within the country is going to be limited. The amount of competition you're getting from outside of the country is going to tend to be handcuffed. And the result of that is going to be that you're going to have high prices. A lot of people know, I'm sure many of you know, that prices in Israel are considered high, especially coming from the U.S., because the U.S. has lower prices than pretty much anywhere else. But there's a good reason for that. The amount of competition really just isn't sufficient in many cases. And there's also a lot of protection of Israeli companies, which makes the type of competition you're getting from outside the country even worse. You look like you want to ask a question, but you should just ask. If you guys have questions, just go for it. Okay, this is not moving it. What should I be aiming this at?
There's the...
Okay. It's a dual sector economy. You've all heard about the high tech in Israel, and that's most of what we're going to be spending our time on today. But the high tech in Israel, as I will show you, is 8% of the working force. 92% of the working force is not in the high tech inside of Israel. And the thing I'm going to show you and try to explain to you is that the gap that exists between the high tech in Israel and the rest of the economy is incredibly large. It's much larger than in any other country, including the United States. It's much larger than any other country. Between the has and has-nots, it's really a huge, and income inequality is very, very high, partially as a result of that. That's true in the United States also. There are many similarities between the United States. Let's just show you what's going on. Take a look at what's happened to productivity. The productivity is basically the measure of the value of an hour's work, or the value of a worker. This is per worker. So this is the value of production of a worker in a day, and if you take a look, or maybe it's in an hour. And if you take a look what's happened at the manufacturing industry, that's basically where most of the high tech is. You see that it's climbing. Israel's climbing together with the other developed countries, the OECD. But what does
OECD stand for?
Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's basically all of the, it's 36, I think now, or 37. There's another country coming in. countries that are the developed countries in the world. The United States is one of them, of course. You know, many of the European countries are in there. You'll actually see lists of them coming up soon. So you'll actually be able to see who all the countries are that are in the OD. And you can see that what's happening, that there's a big gap between the OECD and Israel in trade and services. We're going to try to understand why that gap exists. And that in trade and services, it's actually been increasing in the OECD, not nearly as quickly as in the high tech and the manufacturing, but in Israel, it's barely increased at all over that period. And the gap has widened very, very much over time. Okay, going from 1995, when they were not that far apart, to 2015, when this is a completely different ballpark. We all know about the immigration, the aliyah into Israel in the 1990s, the early 1990s. The Iron Gates opened, and we know that you had the former Soviet Union, you had a people. You had an aliyah, an immigration, a million people come to the country over a fairly short period of time. That's a huge shock to any economy. But that aliyah was a very unusual one. You have a lot of immigration, you know, here in California. You have people crossing the border from Mexico. That's a completely different type of immigration. The type of immigration you have of all the Syrian refugees, you know, running away throughout Europe. That's a completely different type of immigration. The immigration that came from former Soviet Union was incredibly highly skilled and high education. Incredible amount of human capital. The number of doctors, the number of lawyers, the number of musicians that came in. Yeah, you remember.
Well, it changed the face of Israel, and I think it's in part why Israel has unique leverage with Russia, because
we have so many.
There are millions of Russians,
right?
And Putin knows. You know, part of the percentage of the population is Russia.
That's a very interesting. That could well be have a very, very large effect.
I mean, they play it up. When he comes to Israel, they make sure all the Russians, you know, come out. And, you know.
Well, they don't all come out, but there are a lot of them. but they do. It does. It's definitely has left a very large effect, and not just that. You know, actually, I mentioned the musicians. You know, if you went to a philharmonic at the beginning of 1990s, you go to the end of 1990s, you saw that there was a complete turnover. That you went from pretty much, you know, all Israelis to all Olim from Russia. And at the time they were saying, you know, what do you call an Ole who steps off the plane without a musical instrument in his hand? And the answer was a pianist. So it really was just that was what was going on. It was really an incredible situation. But most of the growth that you saw in the second half of the 1990s, when the high tech started moving itself, started really picking up inside of Israel, and the early 2000s, a lot of it was happened because was possible because of those Russian Olim with very high human capital. Because what happened was when they came in, they had to find jobs. They all wanted to work immediately. They didn't want to sit at home and get government stipends. They all entered the labor force very quickly. But, you know, how many doctors do you need? And how many engineers do you need? And how many chemists do you need? And what happened was people took jobs well below their skill level. So you would have a top chemist in Russia who would come in, and if he got a job as a lab assistant, he would be lucky. If he wasn't lucky, he would be cleaning, you know, apartments, because that was what he was able to get. But they all went to work. But what happened was when that high tech started picking up, you had this unused, untapped base of high-level human capital that could be brought in and really start changing things. And that's a lot of what happened. So many of them were able to improve their lot significantly over time. They started off in low-paying jobs, but with time they did a lot better. So that was very important to the security issues. So I said we don't do security, right? But I just want to say as follows. Security is a heavy burden on the Israeli economy. If you take a look at taxes, so taxes, let's take the U.S. political system. U.S. political system, there are two parties. There's the Democrats and there's the Republicans. The main difference between them, at least ideologically, is one wants to intervene more in the government, in the affairs of the economy. One wants to intervene less. The Republicans want less, at least in principle. Republicans, the Democrats want more. Well, there's no right or wrong in that. You know, each of you may have your own opinion about what the better thing to do is, but there's no right or wrong. They're just different ways of what?
My opinion
Is that there is, right, of course it is. And so is mine, but that's okay. So you're obviously wrong. No, just so you have in countries, look across countries, there are extremes in any direction. The extreme to one direction, the extreme to what I would call the democratic side, would be Denmark. Denmark takes 52% taxes. That's not your marginal tax rate, that's your average tax rate. On average, out of all your income, you're paying 52% of that into the government coffers. What do they do with all that money? Well, they cover, you get free education, you get free health, and you get, you know, so there are a lot of things that they do, and welfare is very, very well established. So they do is they take that money and they redistribute. And they redistribute and they affect the poverty level inside the country very significantly. And that's the extreme case on one hand. That's the true welfare state. That's the closest we have to a really real welfare state in the world. The other extreme is among the developed countries would be Mexico, where Mexico takes only 20% taxes, but they also give very, very, very few social services at all. So what their effect on poverty, as you'll see, I think we're going to show that, is really, really minor. Okay, so it doesn't have much an effect. The United States is at the very low of the scale. They take on average 25% approximately, and the services they give are not as much as you're going to get in most of those welfare states, not even close. You know, look at the health system, look at the welfare system. It's not the same as you're going to get there. But Israel, the OECD on average, those developed countries, it's about 36 to 37%. Israel's at 31%, which means it's collecting relatively little taxes relative to those other countries. That's not a little bit of money, but 6% out of that is going directly to defense. And that's way more than any other country. Nobody else is over 2%. That's a lot of money. That means you're starting at 25%, which is where the United States is starting. The United States is also a big spender on military, not as big as Israel in terms of percent of GDP, but it's still a significant spender. But that pulls Israel way down to the low end of the income from taxes. What that means is you're not going to have as much money to spend on health and on education and on welfare and on infrastructures and on the other things that you want to use that money for. So Israelis very much like to compare what's happening in Israel to what's happening in places like Denmark, but they don't really think about the fact that in order to be able to do what Denmark is doing, you would have to increase taxes incredibly. So there are elections coming up next week. I don't know if you've heard that. There are elections coming up in Israel next week. What? Next week on Tuesday. I'm going to be on the plane. I'm going to miss it, but I already told people that I'll be back for the elections in January. What? Okay, you know, let's take one at a time.
You can stop off in the UK on your way and voting there too.
That's right, for Brexit, yeah.
There's no such thing as an absentee ballot in Israel?
Is what?
There's no such thing as an absentee?
Well, only for diplomats. Diplomats
So you have
can,
to be present.
or army.
And you have to go to a polling place to vote? You
Yeah.
can't?
Still the old way. It's still, they have the box full of little notes. You have to pick up the note and put it in an envelope and you stick it into a box. Nothing electronic about it.
And they
And
count.
you're gonna
And then they
lecture
count the
us- You're going to lecture us on tech.
what?
You're going to lecture us on tech.
I am. and I'm going to lecture on tech and on the fact that we export it all outside of the country. We sell off all our companies, you know. I don't know if you know that, but it's true, or most of them, not all of them. Okay, so I don't know if you. So the reason I raised the elections is I don't know if you've paid attention to what's being said or what's not being said. Nobody's talking about the economy. Nobody's talking, or very, very little. What they're saying are very, very wide angles, like we're going to work on lowering prices, or we're going to raise productivity. They don't really get into details of how they're going to balance the budget, because something that's happened recently, actually I'll talk about this soon, something that's happened recently in the past year is that Israel's deficit went way up. And it went way up because they signed a couple of agreements with specific groups that increased their expenditure significantly. After decades and decades of lowering the deficit, of lowering expenditure, suddenly in the last year there were two specific sets of agreements that are going to cost the country a lot of money. And everybody understands that's going to have that potentially can have a really, really bad effect on Israel. though that improvement in the balance of payments in the deficit really helped Israel incredibly. It increased their credit rating to AA, and the result of that credit rating is they were able to get loans at very, very good rates, which is servicing their debt very, very cheaply. Now, when that stops, everybody expects that to fall, and unless Israel does something to bring that deficit back down. But to bring the deficit back down, you either have to raise taxes or you have to cut expenditures. Neither of those are going to be popular types of statements to say. So nobody's talking about it during the elections because they don't want to talk about it, because they don't want to say, I'm going to raise taxes. They know they're going to have to do something. And no matter who gets in, something's going to have to be done. They just don't want to say it. So therefore, you're hearing a lot of silence with respect to economic issues. Okay, that was much longer than I wanted to say, but that's fine. Demography. I'll tell you a little bit about demography. I'm sure you know the Israeli society. Here is the Israeli society. This is what it looks like. Those are the percentages. The top number in each box is a percentage out of the entire population. The bottom number in parentheses is the percentage out of that group. So let's say go to Haredim. Haredim are 12% of, that's ultra-Orthodox, 12% of the all Israeli society, which is 60% of the Jewish population. Okay, so you can basically see what it looks like. This is all this traditional, more religious, less religious. It's not that somebody went out and actually measured how many mitzvot somebody does. This is self-definition. You are asked to define yourself. If you think that you're Haredi from their perspective, you're Haredi, whether other people think you are or not. That doesn't matter what other people think about you. So those are the numbers.
Can you explain what the difference between, real quickly, a national religious and a traditional religious and a traditional less religious? I mean, that's really
right,
slicing.
but it really is self-defined. The traditional, look, the national religious will be people who walk around with this thing on their head, okay? People who you would call modern Orthodox here. Right. The traditional will be people who you would not necessarily call modern Orthodox, or a different type of modern Orthodox. The people who would not necessarily wear a yarmulke would tend to keep kosher, would tend to go to synagogue on the holidays, but not necessarily every Shabbat or something. But things along those lines. But basically define yourself. And then more religious, less religious is just do you do more or less, and you basically just decide how you view yourself. And the secular would be you're not religious at all.
Right. You have no idea.
Right, but people would tend to, until this time, it would also be a question of which education system you might enroll your children in. But the traditional could go either way. There are 4 education systems in Israel. I don't know if you know this or not. 4 separate education systems. Well, there's 1 Arab and 3 in Jewish: the Haredi, the national religious, and the secular.
Oh, okay.
And you can register your child in whichever one you want to register them in. But it's not a sharp line. There's clearly a continuum, and the question is where you place yourself in that continuum.
Let me ask you, it says Druze 2%, but wouldn't Druze be part of the Muslims?
No, and don't tell them that. They'll be very insulted if you tell them they're Muslim. They don't think view themselves as Muslim at all. So you can, and you see, you have 2 sets of Christians. You have the Christians there, the Arab Christians, but in the other, that 5% also includes Christians that are not Arab Christians, non-Arab Christians. So Jews do view themselves as Arabs, but not as Muslims.
Really? What religion do they?
They have their own. They have their own holidays. They have their own. They don't follow the Ramadan. They have their own completely their own holidays. You guys okay back there?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. I'm going to go on and make believe that you're here.
Well, we're all here. You could be here from the distance.
Okay. Just to show you a little bit of the differences between the different groups, take a look at the median age among the non-Haredi Jews, the Haredi Jews, and the Arab Israelis. So you're going from 34 down to 16. That's really incredible that you have such a large percentage. 56% of the Haredi population is under the age of 18. They have a demographic bomb. one of the things that we were able to show is that the bomb isn't going to go off as soon as people think it's going to go off. That the numbers, there's been quite a bit of movement in the schooling system. You can see this, quite a bit of movement towards less religious schooling rather than more religious schooling. So there is a demographic bomb there. The question is how hard it's going to explode and when it's going to explode. You know, take a look at the fertility rate. So you see the fertility rate of 6.9. That's actually up close to 7 now. Although there are those who think that it's gotten lower. I have to see new numbers. But you see the differences between that the non-Haredi Jews have 2.7 children on average. Arab Israelis have 3.1. So just to show you what that looks like in general, these are all the developed countries. Those are the OECD countries. For you know, you wanted to know what they are. Those are them. And if you take a look, this is fertility rate. This is number of children per woman, and in order to stay the same size, in order to stay the same size, independent of migration. Forget about migration patterns. You need 2.1 children per woman. 2.1, not 2, because unfortunately some children, you know, die in childhood, and therefore 2.1 is the magic number.
So wow, so there are very few countries in that
right.
group of countries
that are there. Everybody, all the countries, pretty much, Mexico and Turkey are between 2.1 and 2.2. The US is 1.8, the OECD on average is about 1.7, and all those countries that you see below 2 mean that their population inside the country is getting smaller.
Unless they have
Migrate, yeah, right. Sans migration, in or out of the country. Yeah. Immigration or emigration, either one. And Israel's the only one that is significantly above 2.1. It's 3.11. That's the number right now, and it's been really high for a very long time. But the way that has manifested itself in the different parts of the population has changed really significantly over time. So take a look at this graph. Look at that top bar. Going back, this goes back 60 years, but going back to 1960, the average Muslim woman had 9.2 children, and you know, that's the average. And look at how fast that deteriorated. Now that deterioration is not something that happened just in Israel, although it was fairly extreme, because it's basically caused by improved economic conditions. As you're getting a better education, as you're having more income, you're going to be have fewer children. That tends to happen. The only population that doesn't tend to happen with is the Haredi population, but it does happen with everybody else. And if you take a look at the Jewish population, the Jewish population is that light blue or turquoise bar on the bottom there. You can see that it was high all the time. It was above 3, went slightly below 3, went back above 3. It stayed around the 3 number for 60 years. In other words, the number of children has always been high inside of Israel. And the interesting thing is that if you then break it down even more for the Jewish population, and you take a look according to those 5 categories that we mentioned before, you can see that the number of children is directly related to the level of religiosity, okay? And you can see that the growth has come, not among the Haredim, that there hasn't been growth there, it's been high all the time, not among the national religious, but among the secular. And among the traditional, those are the ones who you see that upswing in the number of children they're having. They're having more and more children as time goes on, and you see this as a general trend inside of the secular society in Israel.
I don't want to interrupt you, but just 2 bullets. It just hit. Trump fired John Bolton.
Wow.
And Netanyahu announced.
Fired him?
Fired him.
For what? As his national security advisor.
They're having this big fight between him and
on Iran, yeah, okay.
well, and also Afghanistan, the whole
Yeah.
Taliban. But yeah, Iran, that's why
that's
well,
not
the other one was
off topic.
Netanyahu announced that
They're
they're
going
to Jordan Valley.
Yeah,
After the elections.
That was coming.
After
and
the-
yes,
Trump
now-
is going to endorse
Yes.
it as the quid pro quo.
Which is what he said. But
Right, the quid pro quo for not
Sorry to
allowing
interrupt,
the
but it's
two
just-
That's
Congress
good.
people in.
I saw the one about Netanyahu this morning. I didn't see the one about Bolton.
just now when I vibrated,
that's pretty extreme. Okay. Okay. So let's go on. Let's talk a little bit about macro situation. Israel, I don't want to go into it too much. This is taking a look. The past decade, this decade, has been a fairly strong decade for Israel. You've had a fairly large increase in income, And the interesting part is that a lot of that increase, more of that increase has gone to the lower quintiles, to the weaker populations, than to the stronger populations. Something that's decreased a little bit the income inequality inside of Israel, because they're getting more of that increase. And part of that is the increase in labor force participation by people from the weaker populations, which means the Haredim are getting into the workforce more, or were for a while. Not lately. That's changed recently. The women are working a lot more. The Arabs are working more. Arab women are working a lot more than they were in the past. I'll show you those numbers a little bit later. And that is a very, very good sign, very strong sign for what's been happening in Israel. The GDP per work hour in Israel relative to the U.S. is still very, very low. It's still below 60% of what you make in the U.S. You can see countries that do much better than the U.S. does. You can see countries that do much worse than the U.S. does. That U.S. that line's wrong. Mark down for me, Michal. That's got to be moved to 1. That solid line has to be on 1.0, not on 0.8. So make believe that line is one box over, one dotted line over. There are only a few countries that are doing better than the U.S. That's why I was surprised why there were so many. But the G7 is at 0.83. 83% of the U.S. The OECD at 73% of the U.S. The Israel's only at 56% of the U.S. And that gap isn't closing. Take a look at the countries on the bottom. You see that the gap is getting smaller. That they're closing in towards getting closer to a higher number, but Israel is not. It's not growing faster than other countries are growing, and this is GDP per work hour, or also if you did this in GDP per capita, that would be true. And part of the reason is Israel's growing, their economy is growing, but their population is also growing very fast. They're growing at 2% a year, and other countries, their population is getting smaller. So if your population is growing, even if you have high growth in GDP, that's not going to help you a lot with respect to, you have a low battery. Okay. I'm going to do this one really, really quickly. This is basically showing you the height of the bar. The dot is showing you during that half decade. It's showing you what the growth rate was. And this is in GDP per capita. And you can see that in the 1990s, growth rate of GDP per capita was well over 3%, despite the large aliyah. You can see that in the 2000s it fell down. That was the period of financial crisis. Went way back up, and today it's low. But those boxes are showing you where that growth is coming from. And in the 1990s, you can see it's coming from capital. You have an increase in capital. You had all those investments going into the high tech inside of Israel, and that's where you got your great growth from. Today, it's coming from more people working. And the problem with getting it from more people working, and that's where your growth is coming from, and not coming from other places, is that can't last forever. You can't keep having people working. You can get the Haredim in a little bit more. You can get the Arab Israeli women in a little bit more. There's a limit to how much that happens. Plus, the Haredi men going into the workforce in particular tend to have very low levels of human capital, and therefore they're coming into the low end of the economy. They're not the ones who are going to boost your economy up a lot. They'll increase GDP. They're not going to have a huge effect on the GDP per capita. This is why I was telling you about the government cutting its expenditures over time. Very, very important move that it was making. The result was a very big strengthening of the credit rating of Israel.
Go back to that. It's a general government and government. What does that mean?
It depends on whether it includes things like the Social Security service. There are a number of expenditures that are in general government expenditures but aren't part of the government itself. They're separate. I can give you. I have that list written down. I think I have that in here.
Just give us an idea what's excluded or what you're thinking.
Right. So I'm going to tell you what's excluded in a second, rather than just guess at something wrong. I've got it in here. So the government, general government includes. It's government spending with the addition of national insurance institution spending. That's the right. National institutions, local authorities, and public nonprofits. Okay, so those are the ones that are excluded in the bottom one, but are in there in the top one.
But they seem to be in tandem with the chart.
Yeah, they do move together because most of it was a result of general government spending. It wasn't in those other agencies. If you take a look at the government debt, external debt, etc. But in particular, look at the deficit. The deficit went from about 4% all the way down to 2%. The deficit now, the Bank of Israel is projecting it's going to be close to 4.5%, which it hasn't been anywhere near that for a really long time. And that's a really bad sign for the Israeli economy. Okay, so now we're going to get to what we're talking about. So I'm reminding you about this that I showed you before. And the question is, why is that happening? What's the effect of that? So the first thing I want to show you is that the percentage of workers in high-tech in Israel is higher than in any other country. Almost about 8% of the workforce is working in high-tech. If you take it the Jewish non-Haredim inside of Israel, it's close to 10%. That's a much higher percent than you have in any other countries, including in the United States. The average is below 4%, as you see on that graph right there. So a lot of people are already working inside of that, and despite that, you have that very, very big gap. When I take a look at who is working there, so it's mostly men. This is worldwide. Worldwide, men versus women in high-tech splits at about 2 to 1. Okay, so about 2/3 and 1/3. And it's mostly the non-religious. The religious aren't working, the Haredim aren't working there. Not necessarily non-religious, but the non-Haredi. The Arabs are working very, very low percentages. The Haredim are working very low percentages. For the women, this actually upturn is a fairly new phenomena, that you have more and more training of Haredi women going into high tech. But as I will show you later on, the types of things they're being trained for are not the high level of the high tech, they're the medium level of the high tech. Okay, they're not actually going into the becoming supercomputer programmers, but they're doing much better than they were doing beforehand. If you take a look at the wage premium, so this is just increasing the puzzle. Take a look. There's almost if you take a look at high tech, and you take a look at other people in other sectors. Okay, you're going to get, that includes non-business sectors and also business sectors. You get a 2 to 1 ratio in salary. Your ratio is going to be twice as big. Your salary is going to be twice as big in high tech as it is elsewhere. If you go only into the business sector, it's 2.5 times as high. And what that's basically saying is there's a real puzzle here. The puzzle is, how could you have such large wage gaps and not be pulling more people into high tech? How is it that you're missing people in high tech? In fact, Israel it's known that there's a real lack of workers in high tech. There's an excess demand, a shortage of. They were estimating a year ago about 15,000 programmers and engineers. They just don't have them, and they need them desperately. So they're trying to.
Are they immigrating?
So they're immigrating. They're doing some immigrating. There's a little bit of what? There's emigration and immigration. Both of those are going on, which is really interesting. I mean, obviously here in California, you have go up north a little bit, and you obviously have a lot of people who are who are here in California, who are doing high tech. Israelis who are doing high tech here in the States. And people have asked the question: Is that how harmful is that? Is that a real brain drain problem, not a brain drain problem? And the answer is not clear, because think of it as follows: yes, there are people who are really highly skilled who are not in Israel and who have moved here and are working here, but they've also brought a lot of close relationships between companies here and companies there, and that has an effect on the success of the companies there also. So there's this quadratic type of relationship there, and we don't know where we are on that quadratic. But this should be bringing more people into high tech, and that's not happening. That gap should not be able to remain that high. You should have people moving over. And the reason that this happens has to do with skills. So we use this skill exam that they do in the OECD, which is called the PIAC exam. And they look at people ages 16 to 65, and they test their skill levels, their ability to take care of themselves in a computerized age, etc. And they'll ask sometimes very, very simple questions. There are all kinds of different questions. I'll give you an example of a question they ask. They will show you a picture of 2 pairs of sneakers. They'll write the price on each pair of sneakers, and they'll say that the store that you are entered is having a sale. But if you buy 2 pairs of sneakers, you get half price off of the lower of the 2. And they ask you how much of the 2 pairs of sneakers is going to cost you. That's not particularly difficult. You have to be able to try to answer that. But that's the type of question, that's a type of question they ask. They ask a lot of questions. But it's basically not coming in and testing your deep knowledge base, you know, how much trivia you remember, whether you play Jeopardy or don't play Jeopardy. That's not what they're doing. They're trying to measure, you know, your innate abilities and your ability to use a computer, basically. And you then take a look at where the different countries are compared to the OECD average. You can see that Israel, in general, is below the average. In other words, the average person in Israel has lower skills than outside of Israel. I'll break that down a little bit more later. If you take a look at the Arab population, it's way below. These are measured, by the way, in standard deviation units. How many standard deviations you are away from the mean. And if you then take a look at the people in Israel who are working in high tech versus the people who are not working in high tech, the gap is almost a full standard deviation. In other words, those working in high tech have much higher skill levels, despite the high percentage of them, much higher skill levels than the others. And what that means is it's going to be really difficult getting those others into the high tech. The high tech in Israel is very unique. It's very high end. There's none of that middle ground. The middle ground is missing inside of Israeli high tech altogether. And that means that the weaker workers have nowhere to go. If you take a look at the percentage, this is for men and this is for women, take a look at the percentage who are working in high tech out of the highest quintile in Israel. Those are the ones, I'm missing a graph here for some reason. If you take a look at the ones who are working who are in the highest quintile, and those are the ones who are pretty much the ones who are there. It's huge. It's almost 30% of the men. It's 13% of the women, or 12% of the women, way higher than any other country. And then the question that we asked going into this research piece was, what is the potential for the Israeli market to fill that void, to fill that gap in the number of engineers that are required for the Israeli high-tech industry? And the answer is that if you now take a look at those who are in that highest quintile but are not doing high-tech, and you take a look at what they're doing, well, they're all doing professions that are really high-level professions, except for this orange area over here, this orange area over here. Now look at that. Pretty much you have here people who are doing sciences, people who are technicians, lawyers. You do need smart people in places other than high-tech. You can't have them all inside of high-tech. The ability of high-tech, there are all these programs the government has started to try to pull people in to high-tech. And what we're telling them is that your ability to do that in the short run is going to be limited. Where you need to concentrate your work is going to be on education. It has to come in high schools. It has to come in elementary schools. If you really want to move the economy forward, you're going to have to do it there. It's going to be really hard to do it from the people who are now already in the workforce, because the people in the workforce already, the ones who are good enough for high-tech are already in high-tech. Or the ones who are likely to go into high-tech, they're already there. So you're going to have difficulty bringing many more people in. I don't know if you know Eugene Kandel. He's a professor at, he was the head of the National Economic Advisory Council inside of Israel. And he has this company called Startup Central. And in his company, he is trying to train adults to move over to high-tech. And he says, he disagrees with me. He thinks that there is plenty of potential to bring people in. And I said to him, okay, Eugene, how many people do you have in that program? He says 40. Well, 40 isn't 15,000. You can find people. It's not that you can't find people, but to find a large enough scale in order to solve the problem is going to be very difficult. Now, if you take a look at, this is according to quintiles, so look up over here. This is talking about the Jewish population who are in the highest quintile, the best people, those who are most able. There you're actually above the average of the OECD. There you're doing very, very well. The same over here, but as you move lower down, that's where the skill level in Israel gets much, much bigger. And if you take a look at the Arab population, those gaps are humongous. So what's happening is that you do have, at the high level, you have really good people, but when you get down lower, the people just don't have the skills necessary. And that's a mark, not a great mark for Israeli education system. The other part is English proficiency. English proficiency is necessary in order to be able to succeed in high-tech. So those in the high-tech sector are doing fine. Those not in the high-tech sector, their English is much weaker. Same is true for Haredim, same is true for the Arab population. Okay. I don't know how much time you guys have, because I know this there was a scheduling mess up.
Yes.
So you guys tell me what you want. I mean, I can keep going. Whatever you guys want to do is fine.
I got about 9 minutes.
I'll talk with, you know,
You just talk faster.
I'll just, fewer jokes, okay. Let's talk about education. So two of the goals of the the last two education ministers was to increase the level of mathematics inside of schooling for the reasons we just talked about before. And the other one was to give vocational training. Move people from general training in high school to vocational training in high school. The reason being because of the fast changing labor markets. Because of the way the labor markets are what they're becoming, they want to have people who have the skills to be able to move into those types of markets, okay? That'll be sufficiently flexible, etc. So here what you're seeing is with respect to the high level of mathematics, that 5 units of math is the highest level of math you can take in high school. You can see that from when they started pushing this in 2012, there was a very, very large increase in the percentage of students who were taking that. In general, the bug root, that's the matriculation, has been increasing very, very much. In other words, people are studying more, they're succeeding more in school, faster than the number of students has been increasing. But in particular, the high level of math, the high level of English has increased significantly. When you, I'm having trouble getting past that chair over there. If you divide that up into the Jewish population and the Arab population, you see the increase in both of them, but you also see the big gap between those two populations. The same is true in English. Huge gap between them, an increase, but a huge gap between them. Thank you, that's much better. Moving over to vocational training, this was the other goal they talked about. There's been an increase for all populations. The Arab population has always been taking a lot more vocational training than the Jewish population. But you take a look at how that's divided out. So we divided the vocational training into 3 different levels. The high technology, which includes computer systems. The medium technology, so those are the people who will be using that stuff, telecommunications, systems control, but not the people who actually are working the computer systems themselves, not the programmers. And the low technology, which is people, for instance, cosmetology or car mechanics. And the academic or general studies, and you see that the high technology increased by about 40%, which is really significant, and it came at the expense of the academic. The medium technology went up a little bit, the low technology didn't go up at all. But if you take a look according to different parts of the population, you can see where it's going. So this orange area in the middle is what's increasing. That's the high technology. The only population for which it has not increased is ultra-Orthodox, not surprising. The place that increased the most is for the Druze. They've really taken off there in the high technology. But you see that increase for all the different groups. And you see the decreases in academic in each and every part of the population inside of Israel. When you divide that more between boys and girls, you can see that in the Arab populations, you see that the increase is mostly for the girls, much more for the girls than for the boys. If you take a look at the Jewish population, that's not true. And the ones who aren't participating at all, they're just not part of this, is the Haredi population. But we do know that those Haredi women are getting into high-tech a lot more than in the past, but it's just not there. Where it is in the medium technology. In the medium technology, this is where the Haredi women, the girls, are all getting into. And those are the things that they're coming in doing, learning how to operate the systems, not learning how to be high-level programmers.
They didn't go to the university, so they don't have the background in mathematics and engineering that usually brings somebody into higher tech.
Right, but that is changing also. In other words, you've got to differentiate in the Haredi population. You have to differentiate between the boys and girls very significantly. The boys aren't getting
learning; they're sitting in the yeshiva and
right.
Doing all the work.
But that's from 7th grade. From 7th grade, the boys aren't getting any math or any English or any computer or anything but Talmud. The girls are continuing to get mathematics. They're continuing to get English throughout high school. They're getting all that. And more of them are going to college and going to seminaries to learn the skills than before. And that is improving, but still, until this point, which is 2017, we're able to get these data, it was really only, but now look at 2018 and 19, you're getting more of them going into the higher level studies. A little bit about higher education. These are the ultra-Orthodox. Ultra-Orthodox, here you had a 6-year period in which the number basically tripled. Now that's about 2/3 girl, about 1/3 the boys, or 2/3 men, women, 1/3 men, and but that is a very, very large increase. The problem is that, first of all, it's still a very low percentage, very low percentage who are actually getting the studies. And the second part is that this graph right here, this bar right here. This bar right here is telling you as follows. Of 100 students who start, 100 Haredi men who start studies in university or college, only 42 are completing their studies. 19 or 20 of them are dropping out during a preparatory year, which they do, in order to be able to go to college because they don't have those studies. Another 38 are dropping out during their studies, and only 42 out of the 100 are actually completing their studies. That's a very low rate. Okay, so a lot of those programs are coming to the realization that just getting the Haredi boy into college isn't enough. It's just not sufficient to be able to really push things forward. A little bit about employment. There's been a large increase in employment. I'm going to point out two things. Arab Israeli women. In 2010, the government set goals for 2020 for employment in each and every part of the population. Their goal for Arab women was to go from somewhere around 25% at the time, all the way up to 41%. By 2020, they want to be at 41%. They're just now nearing 40%. They had passed a little bit. They fell back a drop. It's about 39.8 or so percent. They're going to reach that 41%, or very highly likely they'll reach that by next year. The Haredi men, they placed a goal of 63%. Yeah, they're not anywhere near that. You had this large period of increase in you know what happened here, right? This whole increase started in 2003 when the Israeli government decided to cut child allowances very significantly. And a family, let's think about the Haredi family. The Haredi family thinks that the ideal in the world is for men to be sitting and studying Talmud, studying Torah, and God will help. They work the amount that they need to, or they don't work, but not more than that. The government at that point was giving very, very high stipends for every child that you had. You would get monthly stipend, and the numbers were high. And if you had a lot of children, you got even bigger bonuses. That past the fourth children, the amount you got per child was growing. And if you had a large enough family, you could easily support your family, not be rich or anything, but easily support your family without having to go to work at all. So that was giving them the ideal situation in which the men didn't have to work at all. They could stay and study Torah all day. The women stayed home with their children to raise their families, and you had Haredi families that weren't working. In 2003, those stipends were cut drastically by the finance minister at the time. I don't know if you remember who that was. Somebody, I'm not sure you've heard of, Netanyahu something. And he cut those really, really drastically. And the result was that first the Haredi women, and then the Haredi men, that's the women going in, and then the Haredi men started going into the workforce. But in the past couple of years, the growth among the Haredi men has stopped. It's not increasing anymore. It had reached about 50%, and then it went back down, a little bit under 50%. And now they've just put out the new goals for 2030. They've raised the goal for the Haredi men to 65% from 63%, and I had a good laugh with some of the members there of the committee and said, you don't really think they're going to get there.
I think what's happening is the women are getting better jobs because they're getting more
Right.
education, and they're the ones who have
Sorry about that, yeah. Huh?
the large families.
Right.
The men continue to learn, and the women are now shouldering not only having the kids, but also
Right.
all the home expenses.
And that's going to limit their success because they're also, not able to take those high-tech jobs that require, a lot of incredible amount of time. A much higher percentage of them are working in part-time jobs than of other groups. And all that has an effect on what your salary is going to be inside the family. We did this very nice division between the different parts of the Haredi society. The Haredi society is not all alike. But it was suggested that perhaps it's only certain parts of the Haredi society that are working more than they were in the past. We divided it up according to whether the Hasidim or Litvak or whatever, and we're able to see that the Litvak men are working the least, the women are working the most. And the Hasidic men are actually in the middle. The Chabad are the ones who are working the most. You're actually able to divide it up by the sect. That was a lot of work because we had to basically do this by the identity of the school. We had to take all the schools and map them out, which school was which and what sect they were in. So that actually took a lot of work to do that. I don't know how much time you have, but what I've left, I've made this short. But what I've left is to talk about prices, why prices are high in Israel. So if you have time, I'll tell you about that.
What's, that's what we're here for.
Good. Okay.
Learn,
Good. So let me tell you a little bit about prices inside of Israel. Okay. So prices in Israel are high. If you take a look over here, the zero line over here is prices in Israel, and everybody else is relative to Israel. Okay, so the U.S., all the way down here at the bottom, on average is 40% less expensive than Israel in terms of
but
prices.
not in L.A. or New York or San Francisco.
No, this is U.S. as a whole. Right.
So, you know,
Yeah, it's still the U.S. is an outlier. Even if you do L.A. or San Francisco, you're going to find that it's cheaper to buy things here at the whole. Not Jewish education perhaps, but most other things are going to be less expensive here than they are there. And on average, it's about 14% less expensive in the OECD countries, the developed countries, than it is inside of Israel. That's improved over time. That's starting to improve to some extent. If you can move that chair forward or drop, I'll be able. If you can move that your chair forward or drop, no, your chair.
Move it forward?
you.
No, forward.
Laptop over here.
Oh, okay. I was just aiming at the wrong place. So if you take a look at what's happened over the past, 3-4, since about 2014 really, but since this is Q1 2015, you can see that prices have gone down in all categories in Israel except for housing. And in particular, the one that went down the most was communications. We know that the communication prices in Israel are really inexpensive. I don't know if you know how inexpensive, but I'll give you an example. You can have unlimited service for your telephone with all internet, everything you need. That will cost you somewhere around 30 shekel a month.
Wow.
So less than $10 a month. And that's the cost of it. It's really, really, really inexpensive communications in Israel. And of course, the companies are complaining bitterly because their profits have really. And this started in the mid 2000s when they opened up the numbers for full mobility. In other words, your mobile number until that time belonged to the company. And if you wanted to switch companies, you would have to change numbers. If you have to change numbers, that's a really big cost to start changing numbers and telling everybody that your number has changed. So therefore, they had you basically trapped. Yeah. They opened up mobility of the numbers, and that allowed people to start moving. And then in 2012, Golan company came into the economy, and they cut prices significantly. They acted very, very differently than other companies did. They cut prices significantly, and it started basically prices plummeting down. So they're very low. Communication prices are very low. Housing prices are high. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about why prices are so high inside of Israel. So this is taking you only until 2014 because that's the period I want to show you. I want to show you what happened to prices in Israel and why they're so high. This is the CPI in 2000 and what's happened to the Consumer Price Index. Now, the Bank of Israel has a goal of inflation between 1% and 3% a year. Okay, and this is basically showing you 2% a year, which is right inside the middle of that bracket. So this is showing you the Bank of Israel is doing the job that they should be doing, that they're keeping the inflation within that band. But of course, it's not the same for all goods. And what you see is that what's gone up a lot is home maintenance and food. Okay, home in general, housing prices, everything dealing with housing prices has gone up a lot. Food prices went up a lot. We're going to talk about food prices here. And what's gone down are things like furniture and clothing and footwear. Those have actually become cheaper. So I'm going to tell you the story of how this all happened. What? All right, so I'm going to tell you the story of how that happened. Let's start. I'm going to start with that bottom part, furniture, housing, and goods, and I'm going to take you back to 1990. So in 1990, the Israeli government, or there was protection, very strong protection for all those goods, for all those low-tech type of goods inside of Israel, in terms of quotas. You were only allowed to import a certain small amount into the country in order to protect local production. The government decided to do away with that protection, but they decided to do it over time, not to do it all at one time. And what they did was they said, first of all, let's get rid of the quotas. And instead of quotas, we put on tariffs. But they put on high tariffs at the beginning. And the high tariffs basically gave the same level of protection. But they said, you have 6 years in which to get used to to competition, where every year during that 6-year period we're going to lower that tariff until we get down to 0. So you're either going to have to learn either to swim or you're going to sink. And that's what happened. They lowered those prices, and some companies sunk, some companies went out of business. They gave training programs to the workers who lost their jobs, but that's not always good for everybody. So there were people who fell by the wayside, people who got hurt by it. Some companies moved their production outside of the country, and some companies really became much more productive. They invested in better equipment, and they started becoming more productive firms. And the result was, from 1990 until today, productivity is going up, prices are going down in those industries. So it's a long, long, long period in which we've had decreasing prices and increasing productivity in those periods. And I'm going to get back to that in a few minutes. So let's talk for a minute about housing prices. Housing prices in Israel, if you take a look at what's happened, housing prices going back 2 decades, 2.5 decades, stayed until about 2000 about the same, started becoming less expensive slightly over time, and then started becoming more expensive. Now, what this measure over here is the following measure. There's a measure that Israelis like to use of how many months of income you need in order to buy an apartment. Okay, they basically say, take the average income, and how many months of income do you need to buy an apartment? And this is showing you what's happened, that during this first period over here, it basically went down a little bit, and then from the mid-2000s, it started going up very, very significantly. So let me tell you first, and that's what happened in the OECD. You see almost the opposite type of phenomena happening inside the OECD. The period where it was going up in Israel, it wasn't going up in the OECD. The period where it was going down in Israel, it was going up in the OECD.
Now, where's the United States in that?
In that big mishmash, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that the United States is even in there, but I don't know the answer. But let me tell you a little bit about what happened in the housing market inside of Israel. What happened in the housing market inside of Israel is that the Israeli government in mid-2000s, about 2007, decided to promote the periphery of the country. The way to promote the periphery, in particular Beersheba, they wanted to push Beersheba very, very strongly forward. And the way to do that, they said, was, well, let's stop releasing land for building housing in the center of the country. The Israeli Land Authority owns 97% of the land in Israel. Let's stop releasing that land. And instead of that, let's release the land just in the periphery, just in, let's say, Beersheba. Well, the problem was, this was what we call putting the wagon before the horses. They figured that by doing that, young people would start moving to Beersheba. But there was no good education in Beersheba. There was nothing to do in Beersheba. The infrastructure was terrible in Beersheba. There was no good transportation. There were no jobs in Beersheba. There was no good transportation to get from Beersheba to the center of the country where there was jobs. Young people wanted to live where they were able to live, were they able to have culture, were they able to find a job, to be able to work. And you can't just say, well, just the housing is going to be enough to pull them. It didn't do it. So what happened was that the demand in the center of the country kept increasing, and the supply lagged behind. And when the demand increased and the supply lagged behind, then the other part, of course, was that interest rates became very low, and land became a very good investment to invest in apartments, in housing, and therefore the demand increased even more, and the supply lagged behind. And the result of that was a very, very fast increasing in housing prices, and you can see a really fast increase from 2007 and on, or 2008 and on. It really started increasing a lot. Now, one of the things we looked at when we said when we looked at this is, this is measuring how many salaries you need to work, to buy an apartment. But there's been a big change in the labor market. One thing I showed you before was that men are working more than in the past, women are working more than in the past, and what that means is that a household, which should be the unit you should be looking at, has much more income than it used to have in the past, not just because of an increase in a single salary, but because of the fact that more people are working. So instead of looking at how many average salaries you need, take a look at disposable income of a family and what's happened to disposable income over time. And when you do that, you see that this is what's happened to the average wage. Okay, this is what's happened to that number using the average wage. So you see that big increase. When you look at this is where it started breaking apart back in 2003, when that change happened that I told you about before, when everybody started working more. When you look at disposable income, the increase is much, it's still a huge increase, okay? But the decrease was bigger, and the increase was not as much. And the result is that 2016 looks very much like 1998. So when you now do that same graph as you showed before, you see that Israel compared to the OECD, because we did that for every single country, you see that Israel is in 2016, 2017, the same place it was in the mid-1990s. But that doesn't mean that the complaints aren't right. Since in the last decade, since 2007, those prices have gone up incredibly compared to what they were previously. And it's really hard for young people to purchase an apartment now. That is true. But it's basically gone back to what it was in the mid-1990s. But the one I want to talk to you about is food. So here's food. Take a look at 2005. 2005, food in Israel was on average 16% less expensive than in the average OECD country. 16% less expensive. Yeah, it's not going to take me long into that. And you can see the categories. Now, do you remember when there was social protests in Israel in 2011? Okay, there was suddenly this big social. Anybody remember the social protest issues?
Lining the streets of Tel Aviv.
Right, in the streets of Tel Aviv. Well, the two housing was one. What was the other? It was cottage cheese. Right, cottage cheese. The cottage cheese was the big issue. The cost of cottage cheese. I'm going to show you 2011. Look at that change. Look at what happened in a 6-year period. You went from 16% less expensive to 19% more expensive, and here's the cottage cheese down here. Okay. Those prices went crazy, and the question is, why did that happen? How did that happen? And this is what sparked this and the housing prices that I showed you before sparked those big protests. So I'm going to show you why it happened and how it happened. This is a lot of gibberish, but it's World Bank data, and the commodities that are in this graph over here are showing you the commodities that are used to produce the goods that you buy in the supermarket. Okay, these are the inputs into production of the goods that you buy of your daily food. So it's agricultural products, it's oils, it's grains. These are the things that are the inputs. And this over here, the beginning of 2008, was a huge spike in prices. And what caused that huge spike in prices was a sudden panic over the emerging markets. If you remember, go back to Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, whatever you want. They talked about Chinese consumers that are suddenly going to want to start consuming like Western consumers consume, and they're going to want to eat something other than rice. And where are we going to have all the food in order to feed them? This is something that was said to Moshe in the Midbar also, the Slav. Well, where would we have enough to give everybody what they want? And commodity prices went through the roof. They doubled and tripled almost overnight. After a short period of time, people realized that it was what Shakespeare called much ado about nothing. And the prices went back down to where they were before. The result in supermarkets, the result that happened was that producers had to raise prices. They had no choice. And they raised their prices really high. But then after the costs went back down, they lowered them back down. So you had a short period there where you suddenly had to pay a lot more, but it didn't last for a very long time, except for in Israel. So this is the G7 countries where you had that increase and then decrease back, and then you went back to the original pattern. In Israel it went up, and as long as we're all the way up here, the view is great. Why would we want it to go down? So the question is, why did that happen in Israel, and why did it not happen in Israel, in other countries? And the answer is the first thing we talked about today. Israel is a small island economy that protects its local producers. And the result of that is as follows. You had something called, you all know what collusion is, right? This is not collusion. This is not a cartel. It's a cartel or collusion, explicit collusion, is when you sit down with your competitors and you decide to raise prices. This is something external that pushed those prices up. And then you had something called, implicit collusion. Oh. It's called implicit collusion. Implicit collusion means as follows. I'm really happy with the price the way it is now. I don't want to lower that price. I'm making a lot of money right now, okay? You're my other competitor. I'm going to be watching you. If you don't lower your prices, I'm not going to lower my prices. I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm not reaching an agreement with him at all. There's no problem with it. But if you have a small number of competitors and there's an outside shock that pushes those prices up, those prices are very likely to stay up, because you have to have that extra competition to push that down. So in places like the United States or places like Europe, where there are a lot of competitors, a lot of producers, you have enough competition to push those prices down. You just didn't have it inside of Israel. And that kept the prices high. And if you take a look, remember we talked about footwear and clothing, this was 1996, a percentage in each of those, when they finished those tariffs. And as time went on, you see that that continued going up. You take a look at food, only 12% was being imported in 1996. Go to 2011, where you have those huge percentages in all those other goods where you saw prices going down, and you get all the way up to 15%. But if you want to solve the problems, then the high prices, if you want to complain about high prices in Israel, if you want to solve that, you've got to be willing to lower those tariffs. To make it easier for importers to import food goods inside of Israel. And what I always tell people say, listen, what about the poor farmers who are growing and making very, very little? And I say you're right, 100% right. If there's a group that you think is being harmed, and you want to help that group out and make them not fail, what you can do is you can give them direct subsidies. You can help them directly. That's going to be a lot cheaper than making the entire economy pay a higher price for the goods that they're purchasing. There are people who don't like to do that. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our. That's basically the end of the lecture. But I'll tell you a little bit about what it is that we do and what type of things we do. I'm on this new committee. Remember I talked before about that difference between the high tech and the rest of the economy. The productivity in trade and services in Israel is incredibly low, incredibly low. That's what you saw on that early graph. We have a new committee that's been put together, and they asked me to sit on it, in which we're trying to address that issue and see what we can do in order to be able to take steps to be able to improve that. See why that's happening, remove the barriers that are causing it to remain low. We have that Employment 2020 committee, the one that's determining what the goals are going to be. One of our researchers was put on that. She's a young researcher who did this wonderful piece of work on the future of the labor market inside of Israel. And as a result of that, she's been asked to sit on all these different committees. This is one of them. It's an important one. The one that I showed you before about the high tech, Gilad Brands, has started a huge debate. This is what I told you about before with respect to what's the potential of the Israeli government, of the Israeli economy, to be able to use that to expand high tech inside of Israel. That's a debate that's happening because of that piece that we put out. In fact, there were a lot of headlines of a lot of people who really didn't like what we said. There's a new Breath of Relief program. And a couple of our researchers are the ones who are very, very active in leading that. And the last one I'll tell you here, if I can get it up there, is that we have very, very close ties with the OECD, with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the Bank of Israel. They all come and sit by us. They all come and consult with us. They want to know what our findings are. In their reports, they tend to cite our findings very, very heavily. And the OECD in particular had become very, very close with our research, to the point of where the past couple of times, the OECD every other year puts out a report on every country in the OECD. An economic report in which they have a general look at the macro economy, and they take a specific industry and zoom in on a specific industry. The past number of times they release that, they have a large thing where for every country they release that report. And the past couple of times they've done this inside of Israel, they turned to us and asked us to hold a symposium, and they would release it through us. And we put together a half-day symposium. We would bring in experts to speak about their findings. They would present they would get an early version. They would present their findings. The speakers would talk about them, talk about the different issues around there, and it's been very, very well received. But that's a very close connection we have with the OECD experts, but also with all those other bodies who always come. I think we're going to end there.
So we want to thank our host.
Thank you.
I didn't do that.